Today I'm going to show you how to make Batman's mask and cowl. For this build, I use craft foam or floor mat foam, bevel foam if you have it, possibly some clay foam, and of course coffee foam, putty, super glue, hot glue, contact cement, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. Let's start with the lower half of the cowl. First I'm going to dig out the template from my alien costume because it's very similar to the Batman. Both those templates will be available, links in the description down below. I happen to be using floor mat foam for this just because it photographs better before it's painted. But if you're specifically trying to make the Battinson Batman, then I'd recommend using craft foam for the whole thing because he's got a lot of layered armor plating on top of the shoulder portion of the cowl. So my goal here is to show you how to make every type of Batman costume from the same basic pattern. Then I trace that to foam floor mats, taking care to include the registration marks, those little triangles. Those will be instrumental in helping me line up the edges. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. I cut those out with a work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will prevent any ridges or depressions from forming in the foam after I join the two sides. I smoothed it out even more on the belt sander. When you sand, you'll get these little fuzzy flash pieces on the edge, so be sure to peel those off, otherwise they're just going to create a mess when you try to glue. Doesn't matter so much on the back, but I mean, you know, you're going to be wearing this, it's going to be close to the skin. You don't want anything that might irritate you more than wearing a costume that's essentially made of insulation. Why would you add to that discomfort? I was just at a convention that took place in a ridiculously hot climate, and I was wearing this jacket, and everybody's like, how can you wear that jacket in this heat? And I'm like, dude, it's not foam. This is nothing compared to foam. That's why I love cosplaying in Canada, you know? The below zero temperatures are actually kind of nice. And the snow does make for epic shots. Need a little bit more sanding right here. Yeah, see, this is the texture I'm trying to eliminate, and I've flattened it out. So those divots don't really matter, but it would be best to do 2 layers of glue on this before I glue that seam. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. When it was sufficiently heated up, I pressed it over half of a giant novelty Easter egg that I'm using as a planishing iron, or anvil, to help shape the foam into a curved piece, and then repeated the process. Rolled it up and stuck it into a cylinder transparent for your benefit. When it cooled, I glued the edges together. Here's a quick shot of all the pieces before I take them over to the gluing station. Oh, and just so there's no confusion, this is only half of the cowl. It's only one shoulder. To get the other half, I flipped the template over and repeated the steps that I just showed you. Next, I contact cemented them together. I wear a respirator while doing this because the fumes aren't great to breathe. I just want to show you what half looks like before I glue them both together. Kind of looks like really fancy medieval armor, like a king's medieval armor, some aristocrat. Interesting shape anyway. When I was done daydreaming, I glued the halves together. In the past, I've left the back seam open so that I could get out of the suit easier, but since this is just shoulders, I can get away with gluing this shut as well. Now that it's all together, it's a little lumpy, just from the initial heat forming process. But don't worry, because by reheating it up partially, all of those lumps will just even right out. But it won't go completely flat again, because the glue seams are holding it in that shape. So I was about to just continue to build the cowl, the head part of the cowl, up from here, but there's 2 problems with that. One, it's not really accurate to the Battinson Batman. It's more of a 90s Keaton Batman. And 2, this type of foam is too rigid, and I'm not going to be able to turn my head side to side. I'll look really cool in still photographs, but I won't really be able to move. So that sort of forces me to do the Battinson Batman as opposed to the others, which, whatever. So because I'm doing that, I think I'm gonna have to cut the collar a bit lower to be that outer body armor sort of thing. It's just kind of frustrating because I put so much effort into getting that curve just right. But, c'est la vie. Oil paint pen. Here we go. Is that how I say that? My French is atrocious. Je ne parle pas français. How low is the collar? I'm trying to make this close to symmetrical just by crossing the registration lines, but I do expect to do a lot of sanding, you know, cleanup sanding with the rotary tool later. This is kind of an awkward angle to use the belt sander. Oh, I guess I could. I don't know. We'll see. That's going to be an interesting piece once it's out. I'm going to save that. Like that could be armor. Like armor plating, or it could be the understructure to something organic later. Some future build. I've got like a whole box full of saved heat formed offcuts, and I very rarely use it, but it does represent a certain amount of work, so I'd like to get some use out of it. Yeah, that's definitely... I gotta change this blade. Come on. Nice, look at that. That was a good piece. I'm gonna save that. Once that was cut out, I sanded the rough parts with my rotary tool. Then I began working on the mask part. I started by augmenting one of my smaller helmet dome templates so that it covered both the eyes and more of the back of the head. Since this makes it a new template, there will be a link to that in the description down below. I traced it onto foam and cut out the pieces, same as before, making sure to flip the pieces in order to get symmetrical sides. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. I planished them. When they cooled, they should look like this. Then I glued the pieces together, and again had to heat them back up in order to get the lumps out. To help the reheat forming, I placed it on top of a slightly smaller solid plastic dome so it would take on that shape. Then I cut out the eye holes. I figured out a shape for the cheekbones and attached it below. It's a basic horseshoe shape, which needs minimal heat forming. For the nose, I used this angle cutter to put a trench in a small piece of scrap foam. Then I cut that into a triangle shape. I find it easier to get a centered trench if I start out with a random shape and then cut it to be symmetrical, just because you have like a 1/4 inch margin of error, and that's just too much when you're working blind. Otherwise, it always seems to come out off center for me with this tool. It's 2 razor blades at a 45-degree angle. Well, I guess technically a 90-degree angle. Yeah. The whole point of this is to create a fold without having a seam in the center of the nose. Then I applied super glue to the seam and folded it in. You want to be careful when using super glue on EVA foam because it generates a lot of heat as it dries. And foam, being an insulator, will concentrate that heat, and if you're pressing against the seam, you can get teeny tiny seam-shaped second-degree burns. I always seem to get weird-shaped burns when prop making. Most identifiable fingerprint ever. Hashtag maker problems. After I glued the nose to the mask, I trimmed the inside center of the cheekbone plate so that there would be enough room for my actual nose. The face is a little too flat, so I'm going to need to add facial features. I started by tracing the eye holes onto scrap foam and making a mask. I was hoping to just be able to layer it on top in one solid piece, but that didn't quite work out, so I had to start over. This time, using the failed piece as an eye hole trace, because it's just a little less awkward than having the scrap foam inside the helmet and doing it blind, because there's this elongated ridge structure that travels up from the edge of the eyebrow over the forehead and all the way back to the bat ear. So I figured that out and retraced it. I sanded the edges so that it would look more organic, and then I glued each piece onto the face. The ears are just triangles. This is a bit less Battinson and a bit more Terry McGinnis, but that's just a personal preference. That's what looks right to me. Like I said, you can get all Batman versions from this one template. It's not like you're gonna get this far in the build and go, oh, I like it, but the ears are too long. I think you can figure out how to use scissors. Those had to be sanded on the edges as well as the pattern on the back. The edge where they connect to the head have to be slanted in order to stand up straight. So I cut that out with the work knife. Then I super glued them on. This isn't as strong as contact cement, but it's fine here because these pieces are cosmetic and they're gonna have very little stress on them. To prep for paint, I give it a very quick blast to the heat gun. This seals up the surface of the EVA foam, making it less absorbent when I paint. So pretty much every Batman usually has a little bit of an organic expression on his face, and everything kind of blends. So like this just sticking right up out of here with these really obvious seams and gaps isn't quite gonna work. And that would take forever to fill in with putty, so I'm gonna use foam clay. Personally, I think that foam clay is easier to work with when making smaller details, such as, you know, these facial features. But the drawback is that you have to wait a week for it to dry fully before you can paint it, and as it dries, it shrinks. So you're automatically adding a week to the finish line, so to speak. So by doing this, I'm deciding to hold off on the paint job for a couple of weeks. And this time of year, it's pretty cold out. It's not great for dry time. It's one reason why a lot of movies are shot in California. They don't really have to wait for the dry time of the props, costumes, and sets. So just keep that in mind if you're working on a deadline. I'm not really. There, so now it blends a little bit better. And I believe Battinson's blends a lot more, in particular around the face. But we're just gonna start with that. I'm putting water on the foam before I press it in here because the water acts like a little bit of an adhesive with foam clay. Yeah, that's already looking better. See, he's got a lot of angles on his costume. Pattinson. I'm building this as sort of a basic Batman. Like from this, you can get every single other Batman. It's just kind of about how much detail you want to put into it. Pattinson's costume seems to be less refined, but more functional. For instance, I'm not crazy about how the nose looks on the Pattinson costume, but I do think it's a lot more functional. I mean, if you look at some of the 90s Batman, they do kind of look like Hawkmen with the beak. And that's how to make Batman's cowl. So while I do think the shoulders came out perfect, if I had to do it again, and I might, I'd use thin foam on the mask part. Luckily, I have the templates, so that's no problem for me. So from this template, you can actually make a number of different superheroes, not limited to Batman, because many have the same basic cowl. Night Owl from Watchmen comes to mind. Let me know what you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this build, then you can subscribe and hit the bell icon to see future prop builds. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out the links in the description down below. Anything pledged goes towards improving the video quality, prop functionality, and shop equipment, and allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you to enjoy on the channel. Happy crafting! See you later!